on some level, a political agenda against the police. But then there's also just sort of like hey, you're messing with my, like my daily life. That is not so much I don't want to say it's not a political agenda, but it's sort of like almost like it's a quality of life issue.
Right. So there's a lot going on there. I mean, I think one within the kind of mainstream American imagination, and this is true in the earlier period of rebellion too. The political violence just kind of leads to this sense of, among many, of anarchy and chaos, with continued protests on the streets, with a rising student anti-war movement going on, and many prominent radical and revolutionary organizations. I think from the perspective of policymakers, and many local, at all levels, right? There's insistence that rebellion is that somehow groups like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army are inciting the rebellion, and that it's really outside agitators that are fueling it. But I think, and this is one of the things that the research really shows, that for the people who participated, who felt they had no recourse but to throw a rock or a bottle at a police officer or burn a building or loot. This was really the outgrowth of, again, larger socioeconomic grievances, in part because in every city where rebellion occurred, this was an outgrowth of decades or years, at the very least, of nonviolent direct action protests and very little changes. And I think that's another reason why this kind of post-King period is so key, because that's when we really begin to see the politics of the Black freedom struggle really shift from a politics of nonviolence to one of self-defense. The idea is that, and especially for, the young people who really sustained and fueled the rebellion. In fact, rebellion was the most widely adopted form of protest among young people after King's murder. They had watched the civil rights movement unfold and watched the nonviolent direct action protests that steered the civil rights movement unfold throughout their childhoods. And by the end of the decade, they were still being, the rights and the inclusion that the movement was all about had not succeeded for many. Their conditions hadn't changed, and now they were being policed in new ways. Their communities were being policed in new ways. Instead of getting the major the resources and the structural intervention that civil rights activists and Johnson's own Kerner Commission recommended, they got the war on crime and police. And so, the rebellions were very, very much tied to the shortcomings of the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation as they were experienced, and a response to the growth and the expansion of American police forces in targeted communities.
Let's talk about that road not taken with the Kerner Commission. Yeah. Because I feel like that is the only thing I remember, not quite exactly contemporaneous, but would be the Moynihan report, which is sort of not the Kerner Commission.
No.
And so, but it's interesting that the Kerner Commission is also one of those things that just sort of like memory hold. And, talk about what that commission recommended and what happened with those recommendations. Although I think, spoiler alert, nothing. But go ahead.
So Johnson calls the Kerner Commission in the middle of the Detroit Rebellion to evaluate the causes of the violence that had rocked the nation during every summer of his presidency, and to suggest solutions to prevent rebellion in the future. And, this really allowed Johnson to appear as if he was taking firm action in the middle of the chaos and the destruction in Detroit. And the Kerner Commission released its recommendations in February 1968, several months before the Safe Streets Act passed. And they said, okay, not only did they draw the nation's attention to the role of white racism, the famous lines from the report are, the nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. But they said, if we're really serious about preventing rebellion in the future and dealing with racial discrimination and inequality in this country, then we have to go far beyond the war on poverty. We need a major structural intervention. We need a massive infusion of resources into low-income communities of color. which means that the public and private sector are going to need to mobilize, is what the Kerner Commission recommended, to create jobs for the so-called disadvantaged. That was the term that was used at the time. Public housing needed a massive upgrade and overhaul. Public schools needed major investments in order to provide low-income children opportunities to go to college and more educational resources. The programs of the War on Poverty, like Head Start, needed to be expanded according to the Kerner Commission. And political and economic institutions would need to commit to really fostering full political and economic inclusion for Black Americans. I mean, essentially, the Kerner Commission reinforced the demands of both the mainstream civil rights movement and many radical organizations at the time. And Johnson, when the report came out, never commented on it publicly, distanced himself from the recommendations, and went on then shortly thereafter not to support a job creation program for low-income Americans of color, but the job creation program for police that was the war on crime.
And we should say this was, the commission was headed by, I don't know if he was former governor at that time of Illinois. And I mean, it's just, to read about the Kerner Commission is sort of fascinating in that, like, it's very hard to imagine a commission coming out with that sort of like explicit of a roadmap today, right? That it would, I mean, presumably there were politics, back then, but that it would come out with such an explicit roadmap and such a very clear, directive. And, yet it being buried so easily, it seems like. I mean, maybe that was a function of the time. I just try and imagine, what would happen if such a commission, if Joe Biden called for such a commission and, 6 months later they came out with those type of proposals. Like,
which they surely would.
I mean, I wonder if you could, if you wouldn't have already fashioned a commission that would not come out with those proposals or would be a little bit more mealy-mouthed today, by the nature of our politics. I mean, but maybe that's impossible to. So where did Moynihan, when Moynihan came in, where did that fit? Because we have this sort of like cycle going here that is sort of inching forward and progressing at one point. Like, how does Moynihan's recommendations fit into that?
So Moynihan is such a central and fascinating, but also infuriating character throughout this whole period, right? Because he gets his start in government in the Kennedy administration in the Department of Labor, and then he becomes a special advisor to Richard Nixon. And in many ways, he oversees the very developments that we've been talking about. Moynihan's recommendations were actually the ones that were taken up. Moynihan essentially recognizes the kind of the socioeconomic, factors that explain Black poverty and disparate rates of Black poverty in his 1965 report on the Negro family. But he also said ultimately, Black poverty is not about, socioeconomic inequality, but it's about Black pathology. It's about what he called the tangle of pathology that had been passed down from one generation to the next since slavery. And this kind of pathological assessment of Black poverty gave policymakers a way out. Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors said, okay, well, if Black poverty is the result of pathology and not structure, we can fight the war on poverty relatively cheaply, because then what we need to do, in the words of Johnson's Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who's considered, one of the great liberals of this era, he said, the war on poverty is about helping the disadvantaged help himself. It was, conceived by the federal government as a self-help program. This meant remedial education programs, not the, complete, transformation of urban public schools, as the Kerner Commission and others suggested. This meant not job creation programs, but job training programs. And this lack of structural intervention that was deeply influenced by Moynihan's analysis really limited the possibilities for the war on poverty, which is why, socioeconomic conditions hadn't changed and rebellion persisted through Johnson's presidency and beyond, and also why the Kerner Commission said, okay, we have to go much further. Moynihan then went on to, reflecting on the 60s to say, and rebellion and the persistence of rebellion, to say, well, maybe we've gone too far. We need a period of benign neglect. He wrote to Nixon in a 1970 memo where we don't focus on race at all. He extended that pathological analysis to his understanding of Black criminality. So, then by the late 60s, early 70s, alongside the persistence of rebellion and rising crime rates, criminality becomes seen as something that is latent within Black communities and that can only, again, be cured or solved by arresting criminals and potential criminals and locking them up for long terms.
I mean, is there anything that has had more durability than Moynihan's theory that this is a pathology? I mean, we see this, it seems to me, in every president that we've had there. Yep. I include Barack Obama in this, right? Yep. I mean, it's this is your brother's keeper or whatever his program was. And that this is, it has been a brilliant tactic to avoid dealing with the sort of material, necessities that would, address this. So, okay. So we leave that area, that era of the crucible of rebellion. And you're right. It shifts into, we see this rebellion only in specific instances of misjustice, if you will. And we see it in L.A. Following the Rodney King riots. We see it in Miami in 1980, which was a particularly violent rebellion. Talk about Cincinnati 2001, because I feel like that got lost. In the other events in 2001. Right. And where that is, and if that represents also another pivot.
Yeah. So Cincinnati, I mean, the way that I see Cincinnati is a real kind of turning point between the kind of earlier period of rebellion in the late 20th century and what we're seeing now. So Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati erupted after a 20-year-old black man named Timothy Thomas was shot by a Cincinnati police officer. And Thomas was the 15th black man killed by Cincinnati police within a 5-year period. None of the police officers who had been involved in these killings had been tried, convicted, or held accountable. And when the police department refused to release information about the circumstances that led to Thomas's killing, the people of Cincinnati rebelled. They for several days, what we typically see, people began to throw objects at police officers. They burned buildings. They marched. I mean, this was a mix of both nonviolent and violent demonstrations. And afterwards, or as the rebellion was beginning to subside, the mayor at the time, Charlie Lucan, called in the Department of Justice for what we're seeing now, what we saw in response to immediately after Derek Chauvin's verdict, and a week after that, to the killing of Breonna Taylor, and that is a pattern or practice investigation by the federal government, which is a new mechanism introduced by the 1994 crime bill. One of the silver linings of what is one of the most draconian pieces of crime legislation in U.S. history. That and the Safe Streets Act, I think, are the kind of two key pieces of federal legislation that help us understand mass criminalization and incarceration. But the pattern or practice investigation allows federal monitors and investigators to enforce or to kind of push a department towards reforming its use of force standards and discriminatory policing practices. And usually this involves a federal monitor remaining in a city under question for a number of years. I think now that the federal government has supported about 70 or so pattern or practice investigations, and they remain really like the only recourse, the only route to get accountability. It requires this kind of a federal intervention. But even these pattern or practice investigations are highly limited. So, the one in Cincinnati, the police department was extremely resistant to it for a number of years, but eventually, after extending the period of investigation to 8 years, the department did manage to reduce its numbers of misdemeanors and police killings. But even, this reform for many people in Cincinnati, especially people of color, didn't change their everyday actions with police, and it didn't stop police